The recent Air India crash, which claimed over 250 lives, is one of the worst aviation tragedies in recent memory. To discuss what might have gone wrong, I'm joined by Associate Professor Aditya Paranjape from Monash University, an expert in aerospace engineering and flight dynamics. Welcome, Aditya, to the Indian Sun. It's been over a week since the crash, and we've had people talk about many theories, hypotheses, and conjectures during their that all these things are doing their rounds. But hopefully, with both the cockpit voice recorder and the black box now recovered, we'll get a fuller picture soon. But from an engineering perspective, what stands out to you most from the available video footage? I've heard you talk about the dual engine failure, etc. So could you just elaborate on that?
Yeah. So first off, thanks for having me here, Indira. So the okay, so the video footage that we have is actually in two parts. The first part is a CCTV recording, which shows the airplane rolling down the runway. If I may, I can also use a little model to show what's going on. You see it rolling down the runway. It rotates. It starts climbing, and then at some point you see the flight path almost flatten out, and then it descends. The nose does not quite go down the way I showed it, but it starts descending and it crashes. Um, the second footage that we have was taken, as you know, by a teenager based in a residential colony right beyond the airport perimeter, and it shows the airplane descending. So what you see on the video is literally the airplane going down in this particular manner, just as you might see it on the camera, and it crashes. Now, what you see from the two videos, again, sort of to the best of my abilities and with limited data that we also have from Flight Radar 24, uh, what we suspect is that the airplane's rotation, the rotation is the point where the airplane's rolling on the runway, it rotates and then it starts climbing. This first part seemed to be okay. And what I mean by okay also is if you now go to Flight Radar 24, you see that the airplane climbed to about 600 and the number might be a little bit off here and there, but it's about 650 feet barometric altitude. That's about 450 feet above ground. And the plane by then had accelerated to about 170 or 174 knots. That part appears to be fairly normal, at least the initial part of the climb. But at around 675 feet is when the flight path flattened out. And from there on, we see the airplane basically sink and eventually crash. Now, I use the word sink in the same sense as descend. I don't necessarily mean to say it's falling out of the sky, because that phrase falling out has been used by other commentators. They've talked about loss of lift, they've talked about stall. I'll be very careful while using that terminology. So first bit, we have a rotation that looks okay, which means the flaps seem to be set correctly. There was initial engine thrust that was also adequate. Now, when you see the airplane descending in the second video, and you see it crashing, the first thing you notice is that the tail of the airplane. So there's a rudder here, much like boats have. The rudder is straight, and the rudder being straight means the loss of thrust is identical on both engines. Now, what needs to be understood is, I mean, people occasionally talk about lift and thrust in a very synonymous sort of way. They are not. Lift acts kind of up and down. It's perpendicular to the wings, and it helps keep the airplane in the air, just kind of balances the weight. But it is thrust that counters the drag and helps the airplane maintain its speed. So when you don't have enough thrust, the airplane can't fly straight and level at a given speed, so it starts descending. And that's what we seem to see in the second part of the video. Now, that is what we've managed to infer. Based on Flight Radar 24, this wasn't in their original data, but it's something that they just spelt out in either a blog post or a tweet, that the descent rate of the airplane that they measured in the second half of the flight, they didn't quote the exact instant, was about 400 and if I'm not mistaken, they quoted 425 feet per minute. 425 seems to be very low as a number. My suspicion, because the airplane fell through 400 odd feet in just about 15-20 seconds, is that the descent rate had to be around 1200 or more than 1200 feet per minute. Now, I quote this number because the normal descent rate of an airplane that's coming into land with engines running is about 750 feet a minute. And 1000 odd feet per minute is what this airplane would glide at if it were perfectly well configured, but both engines were out, which is to say that the airplane has almost certainly lost thrust and it hasn't stalled. So this was the bit that we could figure out from that limited footage.
So,
There was also, sorry.
no, please go on.
Okay. Okay. And the last bit I should mention, because this came up in a lot of videos, was about the landing gear. Because he noticed that the landing gear was down, and quite a few people have talked about it. Some people pointed out that maybe the pilot didn't retract it. People have also conjectured that the landing gear not retracting is a sign of some electrical failure. That is unfortunately a matter of conjecture, because it's at this point there's very limited evidence to prove it one way or another. But I frankly would not read a lot into it as of now, at least as far as this basic performance is concerned. But there might be other stories behind the landing gear. So this is what we can see in the video.
Yeah. So that means all this happened when you talk about, falling up to 650 feet. All this happened, that means within 5 minutes of it taking off, isn't it?
No, this happened in 30 seconds of taking off.
30
So,
seconds of taking off. Okay.
yes.
So,
So as
yeah. So for those of us without a technical background, can you explain why that happened, and or what do you think, like, is likely the cause, and and can you explain what a stall is and why this doesn't look like one?
Okay, so all right, let's try and look at a few basic points. So let's go to stall because that's the
Yeah.
easier of the two questions.
Yeah.
So if you look at this airplane and you can
Yeah.
imagine this plane flying straight,
Yeah.
when the airplane flies straight, the flow tends to flow smoothly over the wings. And that smooth flow over the wings is what helps the wing produce lift and not produce too much drag. So typically these wings will produce anywhere from 20 to 30 times as much lift as drag. However, if the airplane's incidence angle with respect to the oncoming flow is high, so imagine the flow coming straight, the airplane's nose is high up, pointed high up. At that point, the flow on the wings is no longer attached, it starts to separate. And when it separates, not only do you lose lift, you also incur a huge drag penalty. And because of that combination, plus the possibility of the engine out, would mean that the airplane would descend very steeply. And by very steeply, I mean with a descent rate on the order of a few thousands of feet per minute, not the 1200 or 1400 feet per minute that we seem to have seen in the second part of the video, coupled with data from Flight Radar 24. So had this stalled, it would have indicated a very high descent rate. Now stalls, it's not like they don't happen, but there are multiple layers of protection against stall. First off, these modern airplanes are all equipped with envelope protection systems, which automatically try to prevent the airplane from going into stall. Second, airplanes are also equipped. So most of these airplanes are flown, as you know, by pilots. They initially didn't take off. If the plane gets close to stall, the stick starts to shake. So it's called a stick shaker. And there's also a stall horn inside the cockpit that also starts to blare. So these cues will be picked up in the CVR as well as the FDR. But the point is, if an airplane is close to stalling, the pilot can feel it coming because of the stick shaker, the stall horn. Not to mention that the stick also starts to feel heavy to a pilot. And these are both experienced pilots. And had the engines been functioning, you could have, had the plane really come close to stall, there was a way to recover from it early on. So not get into a stall, but stop going short, sort of stop short of stall. So that makes me wonder, sort of putting all of this together, that the airplane did not stall. So you have numbers which suggest it didn't stall, and you have all these envelope protection system trained pilots. That combination also kind of supplements the argument that you get from looking at the numbers. So that's the first part about.
Okay. Yeah. No, please. Sorry. Go on. Yeah.
Okay. And the second question that you asked me, which was the first one, which is what went wrong, that is something I've been I'm not been very keen on talking about it because we don't have any evidence. And look, as you correctly pointed out earlier, we've been making hypotheses, we've been making conjectures. But what happens is, occasionally when you talk to fellow engineers, we make a hypothesis, but both of us know, or whoever's in that group is aware, that we could all be wrong. We don't take it on face value. But if you communicate that to the lay public that is not necessarily well versed with these systems, and you tell them that, look, there is some engineer who understands this well and this is what he thinks or she thinks, it automatically starts looking like the truth, which it may not be. Which is one of the reasons why I think all of us who work in this field, I mean, I wouldn't consider myself as an expert. I've spoken to other people who are experts. So I think all of us collectively feel that we ought to be very careful about making conjectures because we do not want to misguide the flying public. We do
Yeah.
not want to scare them.
Yeah.
And while we eventually all want accountability, we also do not want to pin blame where it does not deserve to be pinned.
So from an engineering perspective, this kind of an accident with the modern aircraft, with our modern aircrafts like the Dreamliner, must be a complete shock and surprise to you as well.
It is, yes, because dual engine out is extremely rare. It's not like it hasn't happened before with other airplanes, including modern planes like the 777, but they're extremely rare. So some of the occurrences of late have been because of clogged fuel lines, because of icing. But in a 787, it's already flown 1 billion passengers as of last month or two, and it hasn't actually ever had this kind of a problem. So this is extremely rare. Also, what's worth appreciating is what it takes for an engine to shut down. I actually spoke to an engineer, and what I learned from talking to him was there are multiple layers of redundancies. And it's very difficult to imagine an engine not getting fuel unless the fuel line is physically clogged. Of course, that's one thing that the investigators will look at, but engine shutting down is not easy. So that's what led to a lot of, so when I spoke to other groups of people, to panels, even on the news channels, a lot of the panelists said, well, it could be an electrical failure. It's possible. But at this point, there's simply no evidence to, prove it one way or another. It may eventually end up being that, but we do not know. So point being, it's an extremely rare failure. There are levels of redundancies that are supposed to prevent it from happening. So that's the reason why it comes as a shock. Of course, it also points us in some directions, but at this point, they are so, it's such a matter of conjecture. It's so speculative that we do not know, without looking at the data, which of these possibilities has actually materialized.
Okay. And just to go over it again, just for clarity, you mentioned that the landing gear might not have retracted because of a lack of power. How important is that detail in an emergency situation like this?
That's a good question. See, that's debatable. First off, the landing gear not retracting could be either the pilot did not raise it, that's a possibility. It could also be because the pilot raised it, but there was not enough power to do it. But what some people have said, again, some of my fellow panelists pointed out that the ram air turbine, which also seems to have deployed, it's a small propeller-like fan right behind the right landing gear. It deploys, it spins in the air because of the ambient flow and generates enough power and enough hydraulic pressure to control to run the control surfaces, but it's also enough to lift the landing gear, is what a lot of people have suggested. But also, what's worth bearing in mind is that at those low altitudes, if the pilots were hoping for a miraculous touchdown at some point, retracting the landing gear anyways would not have helped. Second, once you have a power outage at that kind of low altitude, you anyways have very little time to effect a recovery. So, one hypothesis that somebody could have suggested was, well, if the engine shut down, is it not possible to get the engines restarted? A restart takes time. And at that point, at that low altitude, maybe the amount of time available was anyways not enough. At high altitudes, of course, when you have time for engine restart, these little things like the landing gear being up or down makes a difference, because the landing gear being down means you have reduced time before you hit the ground. Whereas with the landing gear up, you have low drag, you can float for longer, and that gives you more time to restart the engines. So to cut a long story short, there is a little more detail that's hidden in that landing gear. But for now, purely for performance, and given the amount of time available, personally, I don't think the landing gear being up or down would have changed the outcome. But there are little details out there, like one of, again, a fellow panelist pointed out that he seemed to think that the landing gear was in a position where it could have gone up had other things happened in the right sequence. So he thinks the pilot had moved the landing gear lever up as they would after the plane takes off. But these are, again, These are all observations that have come from different people. And as of now, because no one has shown us the data, we can't prove that that is conclusively what has happened.
But you rule out pilot error, don't you?
Okay, so I'll be careful there. So what a lot of people initially conjectured was that the flaps were not properly configured, the thrust wasn't set, and that's what I ruled out early on, saying, look, if the plane can take off correctly, if it can climb correctly in those few first seconds, it means that it means that the flap setting and the thrust setting was okay. At that stage, there is no pilot error. What's happened after that is something, it really is a matter of conjecture. We do not know. But having said that, a dual engine shutdown, like I said, is so rare. That it's very hard to fathom, a pilot shutting it down. I don't know. I'll be honest. I don't know a good answer to that. But having said it, again, I wanted to point out that people who talked about pilot error initially were talking about flap configuration. That is not the case.
Okay. And we know the black box and the voice recorder hold, all the clues, isn't it? And they have been recovered, but apparently they're in very bad condition. There's talks about being sent to America. But anyway, what kind of answers are experts like yourself, expecting from this analysis?
So the black box now is extremely sophisticated. So there are two sets of instruments in the black box, quote unquote. First is a cockpit voice recorder, the CVR. The CVR records all of the sounds inside the cockpit, not just the conversation. So for example, we talked about the stall horn. If a stall horn ever goes off inside the cockpit, it will be picked up on the CVR. If the engine makes any unusual sounds, if there are thuds or bangs that are audible in the cockpit, they will be picked up by the CVR. So the CVR is going to tell the investigators what the pilots discussed and what oral cues they had in those 30 seconds. The flight data recorder logs data from all over the airplane, from all sensors. So what we're looking at is the flight speed. We're looking at the angle of attack. I'm just listing out a few select ones based on what we've just discussed so far. We're looking at the mass flow rate. Not mass, the fuel mass flow rate into the engine. Right? If that fuel rate goes down, then we know what has happened. Not precisely, but we at least know where to start looking. There'll be sensors that will also that will record the state of the electrical systems inside. Was the battery functioning correctly? Was enough power being drawn from the engines? Was the rat deployed? What kind of power was extracted from the rat? All of these details are going to be available. What's also going to be recorded on the FDR are the control inputs that were actually executed by the pilots. So, people have been making conjectures that, pilots they set the flaps incorrectly. They set the landing gear incorrectly. Well, if anything of that sort has happened, it will be on the FDR. The FDR will also record the control inputs that came from the software. So this airplane has a fly-by-wire system, which is fairly complex. And it's a software that at every instant computes what control inputs get sent to the flaps, what gets sent to the engines. All of those will be recorded in the FDR. And so the hope is that by looking at which of these has kind of gone wrong, they're going to be able to reconstruct the chain of events. Now, what's challenging here, in my view, I'm sorry, one moment, is this thing. See, the airplane, after it crashed, it's obviously experienced an inferno and it's in a very bad shape. So once you get data from the FDR and the CVR, you would ideally want to look for artifacts in what remains of the airplane to see if anything matches. That will be a challenge because large part of the airplane has been destroyed. I don't know how much they've managed to salvage. But what they'll try and do is, once they have data from the FDR and the CVR, they will have a series of hypotheses that they can test out. And then they'll try and look at the artifacts, the ones that have remained, to see if anything adds up. For example, in crashes that have happened in the past, portions of the wing have survived and tail have survived, and they've shown things like, the flaps weren't set correctly, something on the tail was broken or not set. So that kind of information has been obtained in the past from the surviving artifacts as well. The flight parameters, the commands from the humans, the commands from the software, and the state of the hydraulic and the power systems is what we are looking at from the FDR.
Okay. And how much time do you think this whole analysis will take to come out?
There, ma'am, I don't know. I'm not well versed with how it happens. But again, having spoken to kind of, again, other panelists, some people have said, look, within a month or so, we should have some preliminary data.
Mm.
And the others who have said it might take up to a year or possibly more.
Okay.
So
Uh,
so that ballpark, I think, is correct.
okay.
Especially if, as you say, the FDR is damaged, CVR is damaged, then it might be a slightly painstaking process for. I mean, I'm assuming that these boxes have been shipped to NTSB in the United States, so NTSB will have to spend some time trying to get whatever data out from the boxes that it can.
Mm. Uh, and so for people, feeling a bit anxious about flying, what would you have to say about the overall safety of commercial aviation today?
So I think people feeling anxious is very natural. It's a very human, it's a very emotional response. But here's what I would point out. First off, with the Boeing 787, I mean, despite all of the things that we've heard in the media about the investigations that are ongoing, what shoddy manufacturing practices and whatnot,
Mm.
while all of that has come out and it's obviously concerning,
Mm.
the fact remains that that airplane has been incredibly safe. So to fly a billion passengers, 500 million hours, and almost 14 years without an incident is something of an achievement.
Yeah.
See, if you remember, in the early year, the first year or so, the airplane was grounded because of problems with the battery. They were subsequently fixed. And thereafter, the airplane has had a spotless history. See, minor incidents keep happening on any flight. Engine shutdowns do happen. Hydraulics occasionally. You have one. I mean, so hydraulics come with typically three or four redundant systems.
Mm.
One or two might sometimes fail. It's not unheard of. See, it's a very complex engineering system. But because we add so much redundancy to it, we make it safe in
Mm.
the in the bigger scheme of things. So that is one point that people have to bear in mind, because when we see accidents of this sort, it's sometimes important to remember that that's one accident that has happened after 14 years.
Mm.
Had you gone back a few generations to, let's say, the Boeing 747, airplanes that came out in the 1960s or 1970s or even the 1980s, they did not have such a spectacular record in the first 14 years. So the 787 has done incredibly well. And we have to give them credit for that. I mean, look, there might be problems.
Mm.
Even as of now, what comes out of this investigation could easily be a design flaw. It could be a maintenance problem, in terms of the SOPs given by Boeing or what was followed by Air India. All of these options are open. But
Mm.
again, fact remains, 14 years, no major incident, no hull loss, no fatality. If you look at Air India, the last major hull loss that occurred for technical reasons, and hull loss it's not necessarily a case where there were fatalities, it just means the plane was written off, was almost 40 years ago. Right?
Mm.
And so you're talking about an airplane that has proven that it is safe over the years, looking at an airline whose record has been impeccable for safety and engineering. So I would eventually tell the flying public, I mean, I'm one of them. I mean, I keep flying several times in a year.
Mm.
So that's what we reassure ourselves of, that at the end of the day, these are
Mm.
fundamentally fairly safe systems.
Mm.
And the only reason why we talk about accidents with as much fervor, if you will, as we do, is simply because they're so rare.
Mm. Yeah. Is there any
So
other?
that's the,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, I also sorry. I got to you. Going to
No,
say
that's fine.
something.
No, that's fine. No, please go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah. No, so I thought if you're done explaining that. So anyway, sorry about that. Is there any other point that you wanted to add which I might have missed out on asking?
No, I think you went over most of the essential points.
Yeah.
What I would like to add is this. Look, when, I mean, especially when people, I mean, now, of course, people are bombarded with a lot of information on social media. Always ask yourself what it is that you're being provided. And there, so sort of whenever we study basic statistics or basic data analysis, whatever,
Mm.
you're always taught that there is hypothesis, there is evidence, and there is inference. It's okay to hypothesize based on limited data, because that's what a hypothesis is supposed to do. It's supposed to give you the first conjecture in what may have gone wrong. But between a hypothesis and an inference, you have to have incontrovertible evidence. And if you think what you're seeing is not that, please do not believe it.
Mm.
I mean, we've seen, I mean, all kinds of information going around, and it's really saddening to see it, because fine, it's one thing for someone to just, come out and boldly say, oh, look, with 100% certainty, the fuel system has failed. Okay, fine, we can ignore you. But the people who take such things seriously and they start feeling anxious for no good reason, and that's where I'll tell them, please don't take it seriously. At the end of the day, regardless of what you might feel about Boeing or about Air India or about whoever, at the end of the day, everybody is trying to ensure that we have a safe flight as passengers. Everyone takes safety seriously. Nobody takes it lightly. So please have faith in the system. I mean, I'm not an expert, I'm not an insider to this, but I do know people who are, and these people are extremely sincere, they're very committed. So please have faith in the system. Even if it takes time to get to the right answer, I think the wait would be well worth it. At the end of the day, if that wait gives us a solution to maybe a design flaw that's found out, unfortunately, or there's a problem with some maintenance standard operating procedure, whatever it might be, at the end of it, we would have made aviation that much more safer.
Thank you so much, Aditya, for sharing your insights with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Indira.